Hello chess friends! Today we are looking at a stunning example of Magnus Carlsen's endgame magic at work as he creates imbalances which quickly escalate into winning threats from a nearly symmetrical position that appeared to be devoid of life or any real hope of winning chances for either side. There is no one better at this than Carlsen, and this example from the recently completed World Blitz Championship is one of the finest you'll see. So sit back and enjoy the show from your favorite endgame magician, Magnus Carlsen. Shamanov with the white pieces begins the game with e4, and from Carlsen we have e6, the French defense. d4 from Shamanov, d5, attacking the pawn on e4, knight to c3 defends, knight to f6 attacks the pawn with another piece, and bishop g5 from Shamanov pins the attacking piece to the queen. And at this point we have our first deviation from mainline territory. Most common here is maybe pawn takes on e4, bishop to e7, breaking the pin, or bishop b4 with the counterpin, but Carlsen plays h6, which is a pawn sacrifice. For after bishop takes f6, played in the game, queen takes f6, Shamanov could grab a pawn here with e takes d5, and the correct response for black is bishop to b4, pinning the defender of this pawn here. So if white wants to hang on to his extra pawn by taking on e6, after bishop takes e6, black has ample compensation for the pawn, with the bishop pair and 3 pieces developed compared to white's 1 piece, which at the moment can't even move, being pinned to the king. So Shamanov avoids this line, and instead of trying to win the pawn, he plays a3, taking precautions against bishop b4 so that e takes d5 is a bit more of a threat now. And Carlsen chooses a very interesting way to defend this pawn. He moves the queen right back to d8. Looks counterintuitive, moving a piece twice in the opening just to put it back on its original square. He could have defended with c6, but I think he realized that f6 was not a good home for the queen. The problem is if you leave the queen there and then play bishop e7, blocking the queen's escape route, then the queen would be running a little short on squares. It could be attacked with e5, and then bishop d3 would take away all these light squares, knight f3 would take away the dark squares. So there is potential for getting your queen trapped over here on the king side. So this queen retreat is not really a bad move. So we have knight f3 from Shamanov, and now c6 from Carlsen, giving a little extra defense to d5, enabling him to play knight d7, which is what he plays directly after Shamanov's bishop d3. And you might be wondering why not develop the dark squared bishop first. He's just waiting a moment to see if white will take on d5, because he would like to put his bishop on d6, but then e5 comes with tempo. So he's just delaying the development of that bishop to see if the situation in the center of the board will get clarified, which it doesn't. Shamanov just castles kingside, so Carlsen says, okay, I need to castle, so I'll just play bishop e7. And so now that Carlsen has committed his bishop to the slightly inferior e7 square, Shamanov takes on d5. If Carlsen wants to put his bishop on d6, he will have made 2 moves with that bishop instead of just 1. E takes d5, played by Carlsen. It's a good move. Now this bishop has an open diagonal once this knight moves somewhere. We got knight to e2, enabling the d4 pawn to be protected by a pawn with the move c3 at some point, also looking to jump to g3 and then to this nice f5 square, targeting that bishop. Carlsen castles. We got knight to g3, knight to f6, opening up the diagonal for the bishop so that after knight f5, Carlsen can trade off his undeveloped piece for Shamanov's strong knight on f5. He doesn't really want the knight to hang out there on that aggressive post, and he's trading off his slightly worse bishop. Since black has this pawn on d5, that bishop only really had 1 diagonal to work with, whereas this bishop has more potential scope on the dark squares, having this diagonal, and if it goes to d6, it's got this diagonal. Bishop takes f5 by Shamanov, and now bishop d6. Beautifully placed bishop. So Carlsen is doing just fine here, has succeeded in equalizing the position, but you can see that after c3 played by Shamanov, this is looking pretty darn symmetrical. Opposite colored bishops, the pawn structure is almost a mirror image. You would think that with such strong players as Shamanov and Carlsen, this game would be headed for a draw, despite the fact that it's a blitz game. But Carlsen is a master at creating imbalances in these just dead-looking situations. And so he begins searching, just probing, looking for some way to attack. He starts with g6. Okay, he's weakening his king side, but after bishop d3, he develops the queen with queen to c7, and he's got the plan of king to g7, which is a safe square for the king. White no longer has a dark squared bishop to try to take advantage of the slight dark squared weakness. And after king g7, maybe he'll continue with h5, rook h8, Maybe there'll be a potential attack on the king side. He's got the bishop and queen battery going. So Shimanov just plays rook e1. Carlsen stakes his claim on the only open file. Queen to c2, mirroring Carlsen. Now he's got the queen and bishop battery. And since this point's a little weak, there could be the potential of a sacrifice right here. Bishop takes, pawn takes, queen takes, check. Black would be in big trouble here if he didn't have the move queen to g7. Defending the knight, blocking the check. But Carlsen doesn't want his queen to be tied down to defending against that, so he plays king to g7. And now Shimanov says, I'm just going to mirror your plan, g3. And Carlsen pushes ahead with h5. Interesting decision, and a little bit committal. Weakens the g5 square. Shimanov does not have this weakness on g4 because he can still play h3, which is what he plays in a couple moves. After king g2, Carlsen plays queen to d7, adding some extra protection to e8 so he can trade rooks and then get his other rook on the file. That's what he ends up doing in a moment. And now h3, maybe a bit of a waiting move, stopping any knight g4. So Shimanov's pawn structure over here is a little more flexible. He's got g5, there's no knight g4, and he can mirror Carlsen's structure anytime he wants with h4. Carlsen trades rooks, rook takes rook, and then rook e8. Shimanov does not want to allow Carlsen rook takes e1 when his knight would have to move backwards to recapture, so he just plays rook e2, defended by the queen. And now Carlsen begins to demonstrate his mastery of creating imbalances. He plays c5, giving Shimanov an opportunity to land him with an isolated pawn, which he takes after d takes c5. Bishop takes e5. The d5 pawn has become weaker in its vulnerability to attack, since it can no longer be defended by a pawn. But what Carlsen has gained in return is the elimination of Shimanov's central d4 pawn. So the symmetry is broken in that Carlsen now has pawn support for his knight coming to e4, whereas Shimanov does not. His pawn is now gone. He says, well, I'm going to place my knight on e5 while I have the chance, attacking your queen. But after queen c7, the knight, now hit by two pieces, simply returns to f3. Now Shimanov could have played f4 here, but then Carlsen could have just increased the pressure, bringing the bishop back to d6. Now the knight's hit by three pieces. And there's an interesting variation here that I'm going to show you real quick. It's not winning for either side, but white can play this bishop takes g6 move. Obviously, if you capture the bishop, then queen takes g6 check is going to be terrible for black. The king would not be able to maintain defense of the f6 knight. So what would need to be played here is bishop takes e5, removing the defense of the bishop on g6. But after f takes e5, white is okay because this knight is under attack by the pawn. So there's no time to take the bishop unless you want to lose your knight. So you can play rook takes e5, rook takes, queen takes, and then get your bishop out of dodge. And this is about equal according to the engine. So that's just an interesting line. But knight f3 played in the game. Carlsen exchanges the last pair of rooks, queen takes e2, and he plays queen b6. A little pressure on b2, some pressure on f2, so this queen's kind of tied down to defending in two different ways. But Shimanov says, that's okay, I'll take this opportunity to plant my knight on g5. Maybe I can target the f7 pawn. Carlsen now plays a5, maybe looking to go to a4, clamping down on the b3 square, making this pawn more of a weakness since it's harder to advance it. Shimanov puts a stop to that with a4. So Carlsen plays the queen to c6, attacking that pawn. Shimanov plays bishop b5, defending with tempo on the queen, and blocking this file, taking away some of the value of having the queen on b6, because it won't be targeting the pawn. So Carlsen now goes to c7. Adding a little lateral defense to f7, and more importantly, eyeing this g3 square. Now Shimanov, apparently figuring that his bishop is not doing a whole lot on b5 anymore, plays bishop d3, looks good, it's pointed at black's king side now, but the engine actually thinks that bishop e8 was better. Hitting that pawn with two minor pieces, so black needs to take out that bishop, but after queen takes e8, he's still hitting that pawn with two pieces, now with the queen and knight. Queen is tied down to defense for the moment, but Shimanov's move bishop d3 is objectively fine, but it gives Carlsen the opportunity to start making some threats. h4. Pawn's hit with the queen and a pawn. It's defended twice, so it's fine for the moment, but knight h5 could be coming, followed by bishop d6. Now Shimanov could grab a pawn on h4, but that's not really worth allowing knight h5. And now you can't really stop knight to f4. You don't want the knight to establish itself on that square, no longer controlled by a pawn, with the threat of forking the king and queen. So what Shimanov plays is g4, just stopping knight to h5, which is a fine move, but it does allow queen to f4. Not as bad as a knight getting there, but It is an aggressive post for the queen, and it comes with a double attack on the a4 pawn and on the knight on g5. But Shimonov will not lose a pawn here because he has knight to f3, counterattack on h4. So after queen takes a4, knight takes h4, material is still even, but Carlsen puts his queen right back to f4 now, with the potential to target f2 with 3 pieces. So Shimonov puts his knight to f3, blocks the queen's access to f2, and maybe more importantly, preparing to take on e4 after Carlsen's next move, knight to e4. Once again, demonstrating the value of having this central pawn, without which this move would not be possible. Another point to moving the knight back to f3 is that after what's played in the game, bishop takes e4, if Carlsen were to play d takes e4 here, this would be much worse for white if the knight were on h4, because there's a danger of that knight being trapped. There's no easy way to get it back into the game. You'd have to move your king to give it a square. But even with the knight on f3, this may have been a better line for black, kicking the knight back to d2, then the engine saying e3. Black's probably not winning, but the engine likes it a little better than what Carlsen played, queen takes e4. But practically speaking, this may have been the strongest move for Carlsen, because although the position is objectively still a dead draw, things begin to get pretty tricky for Shimonov. Carlsen is displaying his absolute mastery of bringing about positions where he is not winning, but in order for his opponent to maintain the equality, he has a very small selection of moves that he can make. The best move here, which Shimonov didn't find, is king to f1. Just defending the queen, and if queen takes queen, now the king is coming towards the center of the board. That's what you want. But instead, Shimonov captured on e4. Queen takes e4, and after d takes e4, he probably thought this was still just an easy draw, but white is on very thin ice here. The knight is under attack, and the engine is giving the move knight to e5 as being best, because that knight's going to want to go to d3. As you'll see in the game, it eventually gets there via a longer route. After what Shimonov played, knight g5 looks logical. It's attacking e4, but now Carlsen has e3. And incredibly, white only has one move that doesn't lose. If you want to, pause the video and see if you can find it. So the obvious threat here is e takes f2, winning a pawn, not to mention e2, which will threaten to promote the pawn to a queen, which is the reason that f3 cannot be played here. If e2 is played, now the king cannot approach. The bishop and the pawn are covering all the squares, so you would need to play knight f3, which you can't because you blocked that move with f3. So that's not working. You run into the same problem if you play knight to e4, e2, covers f1, so the king can't approach, and there's no more knight f3. Of course, white has a pawn on f2, so the king can't approach that way. Black is getting a queen. This is why the correct move is king to f1. No e2, and if e takes f2 is played, black cannot hang on to that pawn because now there's knight e4, f2 pawn will be 1, and this is the key line, bishop to e3, knight takes f2, bishop c1, after which you can defend with knight to d3. White should draw the game. But remember this position, because if this pawn was instead on a4 instead of a5, black would be winning here. That's what we see in the game. After Shimonov, instead of finding the only move, king to f1, which is far from intuitive, he falls into Carlsen's trap and he takes the pawn on e3. How many of you would play the same thing? I think I would, especially in a blitz game. After bishop takes e3, hitting the knight, this line is no longer working for white, because after knight to f3, Carlsen has this beautiful a4, locking down the b-pawn so that it can be targeted with the bishop. We got knight e1. Shimonov thinks he can hold it together after bishop c1. Knight d3, attacks the bishop, defends the pawn. It's looking pretty good, but remember that position I just showed you where the pawn was on a5? Well, now it's on a4, giving Carlsen a beautiful and devastating tactical blow. See if you can find it. What should black play here? Bishop takes b2, effectively ends the game, and Shimonov resigns. This pawn is on the way to the queening square, and if you take out the bishop, you cannot stop this a-pawn. After a3, this knight does not have time to get to a square where it will be defending. a1, knight d3, a2. It's over. Black gets a queen. And that will conclude my coverage of another brilliant performance by your favorite endgame magician, Magnus Carlsen. If you enjoyed this content, please consider subscribing to the channel for more of the same coming your way soon. Thanks for watching.